Unlike the other three branches of government, executive agencies do not get their power from the Constitution. Instead, they are fully reliant on the three branches of government for their authority and viability. The budgetary process plays a significant role in this process. Federal agencies live and die by their budgets. No agency or program can exist without their funding. With that in mind, federal agencies play an active role in the budgetary process. But it is up to the elected branches to have the final authority. If we look at our Constitution, we see that Congress is assigned the power to tax and spend. But we also take a look at that the President, as chief executive, also plays a significant role in determining the budgetary process. If we look at the budgetary process as a whole, we're going to see that it involves a successful give and take process between the President and Congress, as each tries to influence how federal funds will be distributed between agencies and programs. So if you take a look at my graphic here, you have all the various federal agencies will all apply and will all talk to the President and say, hey, listen, here are my hopes and desires for this new fiscal year. The President will then come in turn, take their recommendations, and submit a budget to Congress. Once that budget is put forth, it is up to the House and the Senate to review that. Now let's take a look real quick, because this is where the graphic really comes in. It's just not a simple yes or no vote, up or down vote, like we would see in a piece of legislation. Instead, the process is going to be taken through various committees in both the House and the Senate. Again, this is an appropriations thing, so the House Appropriations Committee, Ways and Means Committee, big player here in this, is going to go through in order to make this kind of work. And then they're going to have, again, the House is going to come up with a budget, the Senate's going to come up with a budget. In order to come up with a uniform budget, it's going to have to go through a conference committee. And again, the President is going to have to either veto or sign that budget into law. The budgetary process begins when the President, in consultation with the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, establishes the general budgetary guidelines. The OMB will use the President's directives to issue guidelines for each federal agency's budget preparations. Each agency will then be assigned a budget cap or budget ceiling that it will not be able to exceed in developing its budget proposal. When looking at its budget proposal, each agency will receive their guidelines in the spring and then work through the summer to create a detailed budget. When crafting this budget, an agency must take into account their existing programs as well as any new or proposed programs. The President will really rely on the OMB, or the Office of Management and Budget, for helping to finalize the agency's budget proposals and aligning them to the President's policies. Now, it sounds like from there that the President and the OMB have a lot of wiggle room and leeway in the budgetary process. But in reality, the President does not have any real say over most of the budget. About 2/3 of the federal budget involves mandatory spending. This spending is required by law. Examples of mandatory spending include things like entitlement programs, like Medicare or Social Security. Everyone eligible for these programs is entitled to benefit. Hence, spending often arises automatically, and sometimes is referred to as uncontrollable spending. The President, the Office of Management and Budget, does not have the power, does not have the ability to reduce or cut these payments. Instead, the Office of Management and Budget will focus on the 1/3 of the budget that involves what is called discretionary spending. Discretionary spending are things like defense, foreign aid, education, national parks, space exploration, and highway construction. Though not all of this is truly discretionary, it would, and since it would be considered political suicide for the President and or his party to slash or cut off significant chunks of a particular group's funding, this is the area in which the President will focus. The two graphs on the screen above give you examples of some of these mandatory spendings and some of the discretionary spending that President and the OMB have to look at. Once the President has finalized his budget, in January, the President's budget is submitted to Congress. During its work on the budget, the President's recommendations undergo varying degrees of changes. Biggest factors would be is Congress part of a unified or a divided government? I'll let you sit and marinate on that one for a minute to make sure you know the difference. Congress has the constitutional authority over spending, and its priorities usually do not always align with the President, even if they are from the same party as the President. Once the budget is received, the President's budget proposal is referred to the budgetary committees in both the House and the Senate. The committee's main focus is on the discretionary spending programs. But how does the committee review the budget? Each committee will have smaller committees or subcommittees focused on reviewing a specific portion of the budget. Similar to a piece of legislation, they will hold hearings with the heads of various federal agencies. An agency's budget can be increased or reduced based upon these committee hearings and these committee findings. Because the House is larger and they are able to dive a bit deeper into the budgetary review process, the Senate, on the other hand, is seen as a quote-unquote court of last resort for agencies that funding may be on the verge of being cut. So, if the House is being a real stickler in cutting a bunch, then a federal agency may try to go to or appeal to the Senate. But similar to the President having the Office of Management and Budget work with him in the budgetary process, Congress is also heavily reliant upon a particular group and their help with the budget. Congress relies upon the CBO, or the Congressional Budget Office. The CBO, or Congressional Budget Office, acts as a second set of eyes over the Office of Management and Budget and federal agencies' budgetary proposals. After the work has been completed in the House and the Senate, the budgets are submitted to their full chambers for a vote. Same exact process as a bill becomes a law. There are filibusters in the Senate. If there are differences in the budgets passed in the House and the Senate, they must go before a conference committee. In addition, in order for a budget to pass, the President can either sign or veto that piece of the budget. Similar to a piece of legislation, the threat of a presidential veto is often enough for Congress to submit to the President's recommendation. So if Trump really wants something and says, if you don't give it to me, I'm going to veto the entire budget, well, then Congress has to weigh that out and kind of cost that out. If agreements cannot be reached, temporary funding legislation is required to keep the government working. Hence why you always have a threat of a shutdown. We've seen that quite a bit in both the later terms of the Obama and the early part of the Trump administrations. Thank you very much for listening. I do have a short article I'd like you to read talking about how Trump's claims and how Trump's actions have influenced various federal agencies in his work on the budget. Thanks a lot, guys.